Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Santa Rosa Week TV. I'm Deborah Nelson. Jerry is off today, but we once again this week have our special guest, Mr. Karl Denninger, on with us. And we are going to continue the conversation that we had started last week. We were chatting about banks and bailouts and the elephant in the room issues that are just not being discussed in this presidential election campaign that really is sort of the main issue, which is where are all the jobs and where has all the money gone and why are they running these big deficits. And Karl, we were chatting last week about the bailouts and talking about how this whole mortgage stuff blew up and we ended up bailing the banks out. And I think people... There's some thought that the money was paid back.
Right.
And I don't think anybody believes that. I don't.
Well, I hope they don't.
I mean, where did the money go? Where has our money gone? And it was more than the $700 billion. It was, I think you said close to $4 trillion, was it not?
Yeah, the original $700 billion was put into the banks in the form of essentially stock purchases. And
they were bad stocks.
The Treasury structured those as preferred stocks, so they paid a coupon. Basically, like a preferred stock is a hybrid between a stock and a bond. Okay, so you have ownership, but at the same time you're entitled to an interest payment. And then there was a right of redemption in there, so the Treasury could take that back by taking the money back. So in other words, the bank could pay them off if they met certain safety and soundness criteria. And so what we've heard from Treasury Secretary Geithner, along with President Obama and everybody else, is that, well, the $700 billion was paid back, with the exception of the money that was given to GM, which went down the toilet. Okay,
as everyone knew it would.
As everybody knew it would. Okay. But other than that, we got all of our money back, and we actually made a profit because this interest payment was made during those periods of time. All right. That's a very pleasant fiction. What actually happened was we put that money in to make sure that there wasn't going to be a bank run tomorrow and that all of the banks in America would not suffer under that run and potentially collapse. That normally wouldn't be a problem because if you had people go and redeem their money, the bank could sell assets into the marketplace and get the money that it needs to pay you by doing that. But if you have, as a bank, made a bunch of bad loans, then the assets that you have are not worth anything, or at least are worth a lot less than what you say they are. And we saw a lot of that during the actual collapse itself. We had Colonial National, which was a fairly large lender, that went down, and when it was acquired, it turns out that their assets were overvalued by almost 40%. So when the acquisition went through and a real accounting was done, 40% of all the assets that they claimed they had were actually worth nothing. Okay, so 40% discount, basically. This, of course, is grossly more than they actually had in terms of excess money laying around. And so they would have gone bankrupt, and so would have pretty much everybody else. Colonial was involved in making all kinds of commercial real estate loans. So some of the condos down in the south part of the county here, as well as over in Panama City that blew up, were some of their projects, along with others in other parts of the state and elsewhere. But that wasn't the whole story because, of course, we had the same kind of thing happen in the residential market with option arms and the foreclosures that we've seen. So what has happened over the last 4 years to fill in this hole and make things appear to be okay is that the federal government has undertaken an unprecedented amount of deficit spending. They've handed out literally trillions of dollars in unemployment benefits, in various so-called stimulus programs, the so-called shovel-ready projects and things like this. Okay, and all of this has just been literally spent into the economy. And then the Federal Reserve has come in and performed what is now up to 3 rounds of what they call quantitative easing, which is basically bond buying. Okay, so
explain what people don't understand. Isn't that sort of like they're printing invisible money? I mean, is that
yes and
accurate?
no? Yes and no. Printing money would be what would happen if the Treasury was to send everybody in the country a $500,000 check tomorrow and issued no Treasury bills or notes, no debt to cover that. Okay, that's illegal, by the way, which is why it hasn't happened because they would have loved to have done that. But that's exactly what happened to the Weimar Republic and how they collapsed. Okay, which is why it's illegal because it leads immediately to a shutdown of all lending in the economy and then a failure of the economic and monetary system involved.
This is when people had the wheelbarrows in Germany before the World War II full of cash to buy bread.
It's also what happened in Zimbabwe with Mugabe and his games with monetary debasement. I have a sealed in glass set of Zimbabwean bills, billion-dollar bills.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, well, this is what happens, right? The money becomes effectively worthless. So this is the problem with doing that, which is why it's not done. But what the federal government essentially is doing when it spends in deficit is the same as exerting a tax upon everything that goes on in the economy. So over the last 4 years, the federal government has run a deficit of about 11 to 12% of the economic output of the nation. This year, we're not, of course, quite done with closing the books yet, because they go on a September 30th end of year. I work off a calendar year because everybody else does too, and it's easier.
And let's be clear, the deficit is the difference between what's coming in taxes
And what they spend.
and what they're spending yearly.
Right.
Every year, that deficit then adds to the debt.
That's correct.
Which is already quite high.
That's correct. And there's two ways to look at this. There's the way that the Congressional Budget Office and the Treasury call it, and then there's the honest way. And the honest way is you simply look at how much money is out in debt at the beginning of the year and how much money is out in debt at the end of the year, because nobody borrows money that they're not going to spend. Okay?
Right.
So you can get rid of all the game playing that goes on in the various Treasury statements by simply taking a look at the debt to the penny series, which the Treasury publishes. You can look at it for any day going back 20 years and subtract one from the other, and there's the amount of the deficit that has actually gone into the economy. What has happened in this case, though, is that this is exactly like a tax on the American consumer. Because if I have $10,000 in the economy, in total, across everything in the economy, and I have produced 10,000 units of production, whether it be gallons of gasoline, loaves of bread, whatever, it doesn't matter what they are, then $1 would buy 1 unit of production. If the government then puts another 1,000 units of dollars into the economy, I now need 1.1 units.
And this is these units they borrow from China.
Well, it doesn't matter.
It
doesn't matter whether they either borrowed them from China or the Federal
Right.
Reserve created the additional reserves and took them in. So what has actually happened is that it is exactly the same when the federal government runs a deficit. It is exactly the same as if the IRS man came to your door, and if you had $10,000 and he said, "Give me $1,000 right now," and he forcibly extracted it from you with guns if he had to. Okay, I mean, we do it every year. April 15th, we file our tax returns, we send them in, right? So normally they don't need to use guns because we voluntarily cooperate with them. But the effect is exactly the same. Deficit spending at the federal level is no different than a tax increase. It's exactly the same as a tax.
Now, it hits the individual person in the sense that groceries are more expensive,
Yes.
gas is more expensive.
But it hits everybody equally in exactly the same amount. So we have allegedly a progressive tax system, right? The poor people pay a lower tax rate than the rich people do, okay? But in fact, when you have deficit spending, there is no proportionality applied to any of this. Everybody
Right.
gets hit from the first dollar that they transact in at exactly the same rate, and that rate is simply the percentage of gross domestic product is this deficit, whatever that is. This is why there's been no middle-class progress for more than 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's more like 40 years. I mean,
But this is why it's happened. This is why they had to blow a housing bubble, because without this, your actual inflation-adjusted income was decreasing more than 10% a year for an entire decade. Okay, well, you can't continue to do that for very long. You're eventually not going to be able to buy any food, okay, or gasoline. You're not going to be able to get to work. So what do? Well, you go out and you take a home equity line out against your house, or you refinance, and thereby you maintain your standard of living in the illusion that everything is okay. But what have you done? You've taken capital that you accumulated, and you've substituted debt for it.
everybody's in debt.
That's right.
Yeah, the debt levels are stratospheric.
And this,
I think we all understand that.
But this is this is what they've tried to do. Okay, so it wasn't $700 billion; it's closer to $5 trillion. And now we're getting to the point where this reduction of leverage that everyone talks about, that the economy has delevered. You hear this on CNBC all the time and some of the other financial shows. It's a lie. There has been no net reduction in leverage throughout the consumer economy at all. Student loans have actually gone up in volume. Okay, if you look at mortgages have decreased in outstanding balance by about 9% since the top. However,
the interest rate has gone down, but nobody can get a refinance.
Well, yeah, because their collateral's not worth anything.
Yeah.
That's the problem. The amount of the outstanding mortgages has gone down by about 9%, but the value of houses has gone down by a third. So the leverage has actually gone up instead of down. Okay, we haven't taken leverage out of the system anywhere. That's a lie.
And by leverage, what do you mean?
The amount of debt that you have in the system compared to the amount of output.
Gotcha.
Okay, it's very simply it's systemic leverage. That's what it's about.
And everybody's in debt up to their eyeballs. Is what it.
Well, you
comes
shouldn't
down
be,
to.
but yeah, people are.
The middle class is what I'm thinking. The
Yeah.
average middle class guy is
Right.
swimming in debt.
And so what you have is you have the federal government, the Federal Reserve, and the commercial banks that have all conspired to put together this program, okay, where essentially the federal government will hand out all kinds of money through various sorts of free programs, whether it be welfare, whether it be Social Security, whether it be Medicare payments, whether it be food stamps, okay, it doesn't matter what form it comes in.
The military.
Military spending is part of this as well, okay, but all of this money gets spent into the economy, but it's not taxed from the people, at least not that you can see. And people say, well, if we didn't run this deficit, we'd have to dramatically raise taxes. And my answer is, you're already paying the taxes, it's just invisible. If you're going to tax me to pay for some government program that we have all agreed that we want to have, I want that tax to be visible where I can see it, because that is the only way that the people can realistically say yes or no to whatever is going on within the government itself. So deficit spending is inherently a dishonest practice.
Well, I think what strikes me, and I think it's dawning on a lot of people, is you have these practices that benefit a couple of, small little group of people. I think that we can safely say the banks are not suffering right now. And then it comes down to the payback time, and now we want to cut the social programs. We want to cut all this stuff that, people who are floundering, that's their lifeline. Austerity measures like they're doing in Europe, we want to implement those. And so the middle class, and the poor end up suffering for what was something that a very small group of people benefited from.
Well,
and are still benefiting from.
That's only partially true, okay? People in general in America have lived beyond their means.
Right.
up through the middle class.
Although most of them would not agree with you.
Well, they may not, but
we think 5 TVs is the norm. I mean, that's what you're talking about.
I understand, but if you've refinanced your house and spent it,
right.
you have been living beyond your means.
Right.
Okay? If you took out a home equity loan, you have been living beyond your means. If you bought a car on 100% credit instead of putting 20% down and took out a 7-year loan and rolled your previous car's payment into that, you're living beyond your means. Okay.
And I think a lot of those people have now suddenly figured out, my God, I've painted myself into a corner, and they're at the crunch, and people are going out and they can't even get a job.
Right.
Digging a ditch.
Well, but this is what happens when you have these.
What do they do?
Well, when you have these backdoor tax increases, this is what happens. Okay, because you have built into the system a level of taxation that doesn't support that business person hiring another individual. All right, if I cannot make a profit as a business person by hiring you, I'm not going to hire you. And if your embedded cost of employment is greater than what you produce, you don't get the job. It's that simple. All right, especially in the healthcare system, which is where the biggest part of this problem is coming from a budgetary point of view, we've gone from spending $53 billion at the federal level on healthcare in 1980 to $850 billion last year. That's a 9.3% compounded rate of growth. That means that the spending doubles every 7.7 years. To put a not so fine point on that, from $850 billion, that means that we will spend more on health care at the federal government level than we spend on everything in the federal government 20 years from now. And yet you have people like Jeff Miller and Steve Sutherland, okay, who represent people who see this in this district, that have stood up in town halls and have said nobody 50 years age or older is going to have their Medicare tampered with. The only way that can happen is if the federal government can find some way to spend $14 trillion on medical care 30 years from now. That is not going to happen. Okay? So, I mean, with a $4 trillion budget, tell me how they're going to spend $14 trillion.
It's outrageously expensive.
Well, it can't happen.
Yeah.
Okay? So, how do you solve this? You cannot just say, well, we're just going to cut Medicare and Medicaid and we're going to fix it.
Well, there's some thought the government could implement some kind of price control over that, just by becoming, of course, I'm a single payer person.
Right.
If they become the only person that provides the payments, then they effectively control the pricing system.
Well, except how do you do that in reality? Because we could today get rid of all of the special protections in the law that the medical industry enjoys. In 30-some states today, if you want to open an MRI center to compete with the other MRIs in the area, you have to have what's called a certificate of need. These laws are called con laws. They are correctly named. They are cons.
Yeah.
Okay? The people who sit on those advisory boards are the people that own the current systems. So if you come in and say, I want to set one of these up and charge $200 to scan your elbow instead of $2,000, you'll never get a license. And this kind of thing, Florida, by the way, does not have these laws. However, Florida has other restrictions on free market behavior that have the same sort of effect.
Yeah, we've seen that with the hospitals trying to open branch offices.
Well, not only that, they buy up physicians' practices, and then the same test that you had done the week before for $200 is suddenly $500 or $1,000. And the reason is because they're able to effectively impose monopoly pricing. Okay, this kind of action is illegal in virtually every other line of business. If I tried to do this as an internet company, I would be in jail right now. Still be sitting in prison 20 years later.
I think it's not illegal in the power business, but that's another
electricity
business.
There's another one.
That's another
well,
discussion.
actually, it is supposed to be illegal. They're investigating something in California, and more rigging of the market. Yeah, but this is where the problem lies. Okay, it just is another example. I cannot go into Canada with my car, load up the trunk full of Viagra at $2 a pill, come back across the bridge and sell for $2.10.
You go to jail for that.
I'll go to prison for that. That's a felony. Yeah. All right. Well, so what happens? 330 million people in America pay for the development of every advanced drug device and procedure that is then consumed by the rest of the world for free.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We cannot do this. There's 5 billion people in the world, and there's 330 million of us.
Yeah.
All right. But this is what has occurred through time. And we have very powerful lobbying groups within this industry, just like in a number of
It's the pharmaceutical industry that you're talking about.
Not just pharmaceuticals,
but
all of the medical providers,
Yes.
whether it be the pharmaceutical industry, whether it be the device manufacturers, whether it be the big machinery makers like General Electric that makes MRI machines and CAT scans and PET scans and things like this. All of these different companies that make these devices have, along with hospital providers, have put together sets of laws that make this kind of thing the way that the world works. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan passed a law called EMTALA. That's the law that says that if you're having a heart attack when you're walking down the street, they have to take you to the nearest hospital regardless of your ability to pay. So, what happens? You don't have any money. You don't get taken to a charity hospital because those have been destroyed by this. Okay, you get taken there, you get $200,000 worth of treatment, but you don't have any money. And you also don't have any insurance because you foolishly decided to gamble with your health. All right? Well, that would be fine. Normally what would happen is you die, right? Well, we can't let that happen. So now you need to have your appendix out. And that procedure should cost a couple of $1,000s. Instead, it costs $20 because you get to pay 10% of the $200,000 I didn't pay. Well, how is this right? Okay, how is this just?
No, I agree.
Because of my personal decisions.
Right,
I get to shift the cost onto you. And this is what it goes on throughout the entire system. But again, if you tried to do this in other lines of work, you'd go to prison for it.
And we don't have time for the single payer discussion. We'll have you back for that because that's going to be an hour and a half. Let's talk about these austerity measures. We've seen in Europe where they've cut spending and they've tried to close their deficits, and we've seen the riots in the street, and the cost of stuff has gone up for the average middle class people and so on and so forth. Is that coming here? Can that be avoided? Is there something that our government could do financially that would help avoid that, or is the middle class here just destined to fall on hard times?
Yes and no. Okay, can we avoid the contraction of the leverage in the system? No, but the longer we continue to try, the more the middle class gets squeezed. What you're seeing over in Europe right now is happening because that implicit tax that comes from the deficits and the transfers from Germany to these other countries is falling on those people and hitting them to the point that they can't afford to eat anymore. Okay, hungry bellies riot.
Right.
That's just a basic fact. Can that come here to the United States? Oh, absolutely. Look at the explosive growth of people on food stamps and Social Security disability and all these other things. What happens when those programs can't be funded anymore and they have to be cut off?
Right.
The solution to this problem is to pull the leverage out of the system, stop playing these games with the banks, stop the deficit spending, and force everybody to mark their assets to the market. Now, you will have a lot of bank failures if that happens.
Right.
The stock market will crash, okay? House prices will crash. But think about this. If you're a relatively poor American today, or you're a lower middle class person, you're probably renting an apartment somewhere here in the local area, or you're living with friends. Do you want house prices to be low or high?
Right.
Would you like them to be really low?
Sure.
Okay, because then you can afford to buy a house,
We'd all like to see that.
Yeah. Would you like gasoline to be $4 a gallon like it is today?
Right,
or would you rather it be $1 a gallon or $2 a gallon, okay? Would you like prices to be low or high? And people say, well, but then my wages would go down because, that's the way it works, right, if there's deflation. My answer to that is, well, yeah, but if you were prudent and you saved capital, and you actually have savings.
But nobody's done that, though.
Well, not nobody. That's not entirely true. Look at all the retirees, all the senior citizens that are trying to live on fixed income.
That's true.
Okay, that have done the right thing. They didn't go out and blow all their money on exotic cruises and things like this. They actually have some cash. Okay, and they've seen that be systemically devalued. Well, okay, so now Mr. Senior Citizen, maybe his Social Security goes poof and his Medicare goes poof. All right, but he's got a big pile of money, and all of a sudden everything is very cheap. Now that operation that was going to cost $50,000 or $100,000 is $2,000, and he can afford to pay for that out of his cash. All right, what does he do with the rest of this money? Well, maybe he puts it to work. He starts a business. So what do we transition to? We transition to an economy where people don't borrow everything they have, where the way that you become wealthy, the way you actually get advancement from an economic perspective, is through entrepreneurship. Wasn't that what we're supposed to be about? Isn't that how most people, 100 years ago made their money? They opened up a little shop, they became a bigger shop, and then maybe they had 5 shops. Right?
I don't think there's any question there's going to be a reset somewhere down the road. I mean, there's going to have, because of the financialization. Right. I mean, I think you said it was 70% now of the economy, it's financial instruments?
70% of the trading that goes on in the stock market is computers.
Yeah.
That are just handing shares of
It's not Ford making an automobile and all of that's all the way down the line.
Right, but the problem is that the reason that the automobile costs so much is because we've embedded all these taxes into the system through all this fraudulent lending. And it's essentially what this comes down to is counterfeiting. That's the essence of what's happened, is that these institutions have emitted credit into the system. And if you think about it, it's pretty easy to understand. Nobody ever explains it this way because they don't want the people to get it, okay? But a $100 bill in your wallet spends exactly the same way as does your Visa card. One of them you got because you went to work and you earned money, okay? And then you took your paycheck, well, back when we had real paychecks and we didn't have direct deposit, right? You took your paycheck to the bank and you cashed it, and the cashier gave you a bunch of $100 bills. Okay. The second is a promise that you'll get up and go to work tomorrow. But they spend exactly the same way at the store. All right? So for those people who say that, well, this credit stuff doesn't matter, what happens when you have a lot of money chasing things that are limited in supply? The price goes up, right? Because the merchant can charge more.
Right. Because
he's got more people trying to buy it. Oh, gee. Something like that seems to have happened with college costs, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's obviously that's another issue.
Something very similar like that happened with healthcare, didn't it? Something like that happened with houses. I wonder why.
Well, I think the concern though is if you implement these austerity measures like they have in Europe and in some other places, and you allow this reset to happen. I mean, I think you're looking at some serious unemployment at that point.
Temporarily, but see, here's the thing. The austerity measures that they're talking about implementing in Europe don't involve defaulting the debts that were contracted under false and fraudulent pretense. Because if they did that, then the banks would go under.
You're suggesting they go ahead and but that would...
Oh, I'm suggesting that which you loaned out that people can't pay doesn't get paid.
In other words, let people declare bankruptcy.
Absolutely.
Have no chance of repaying their ridiculous mortgage or whatever they're stuck with.
If you're broke, you're broke.
Right.
Okay.
That's a lot of people.
Well, that's fine.
That's a lot of bankruptcy.
But you know what? You don't get less broke by pretending that you aren't.
Right.
The deeper, the first rule of holes is when you're in one, stop digging.
Right.
Right.
Well, I think we made it harder to declare bankruptcy now.
We have, and that was a big mistake too. One of the reasons that college educations have gotten so expensive and the cost has exploded is that we passed through our Congress a series of laws that made it essentially impossible to get rid of student loan debt. And so as a result, now anybody will give you a loan to borrow as much money as you want to go to school. Well, what happens when a college can charge whatever they want because you can go borrow it? Right? The cost goes to the moon. Right? We don't have cinder block dormitories that are kind of like the brigades that you had in old army barracks. Now they look like luxury condominiums inside. Well, that's fine if you happen to have the money to pay for a luxury condominium, but what do you do for the student that doesn't have those kinds of resources?
Yeah.
Well, he borrows the money. Well, that's nice. Now how's he going to pay it back? Well, the answer is he will eventually if he can't declare bankruptcy. It's just going to ruin his life on the way.
So he gets a medical degree and overcharges for the MRI.
You can try that until people don't have any money to pay for the MRIs.
Right.
Okay.
And that's the spiral.
Yeah, that's the spiral. But now we've hit the wall. We've run out of games and we've run out of the ability to do this. The key thing that people have to understand is that exponential cycles cannot continue forever. Okay, it's
and
a
we
basic
talked earlier,
fact.
but you can maintain that illusion for some time though,
For a while.
and which is what we were clinging to it, but it's through borrowing.
That's what we were doing in 2007 when we hit the wall. In the third quarter, we put $7 of debt into the economy for every dollar of productive output that we generated. Now, that sounds impossible. How can you add $7 into the economy of borrowing and not generate $7 of new production? Because I never borrow money that I don't intend to spend. Okay, and the answer is the economy really contracted by 6 of the $7. Okay, because the $7 did get spent, but there was $6 of contraction that was hidden by doing this.
Yeah.
All right, and that was the essential component of the game that was occurring with all the option arms and the hinky mortgages and things like this. And when people hit the wall and couldn't refinance anymore, that's when it all came apart.
So how do you control the banks? I mean, do we need to go back to Glass-Steagall? I mean, how do you keep an eye on them in the future to make sure this stuff doesn't happen again?
Well, it's not really all that hard. Glass-Steagall was a good start. But as we saw in the 1980s, Glass-Steagall was circumvented. Okay,
Yes.
Alan Greenspan allowed the Citibank merger, the original one, which, by the way, was illegal under Glass-Steagall. It was flatly against the law for a bank and insurance company to combine. Okay, so he did it anyway, and then figured he could get them to pass a law to make that retroactively legal, which is what happened. So what I advocate is a standard called $1 of capital, which says that for every dollar of lending you do, it must either be backed by collateral that is taken and valued at today's market price, or $1 of your own capital, which means you have to borrow from someone else, you have to issue bonds, you have to sell stock, or you have to retain earnings. Okay, and that no other borrowing is allowed to take place, no other lending is allowed to
So
take
no
place.
fractional.
This doesn't necessarily implicate fractional reserve, because if I have goods coming from China, for example, and I have a loan out to secure the delivery of those goods, if the person doesn't pay, I can seize the goods. Okay, so this is a more nuanced standard. If you actually said no fractional reserve lending of any kind ever period, we'd go back to the 1500s in the economy within an afternoon and stay there.
And this is where the banks can, and we mentioned this last show, the banks can lend out more than they actually have.
They actually
reserves.
create the money first and then try
Right.
to fill the reserves.
It's kind of imaginary
actually,
money.
It's actually a scam.
Yeah, well,
It's a legal scam, but it's a scam.
but that, I mean, do you need to separate? I mean, do we need to go back and we need to separate the commercial, this is my savings money from speculative investment?
Glass-Steagall's a good start, but it's not enough.
Yeah. How much further are you going to go?
Well, that's $1 capital would
Okay.
fix this.
I think we're out of time. So, Karl Denninger, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For joining us. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll have you back sometime.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. This is Deborah Nelson, Santa Rosa Week TV. Good night.